And the title of today's sermon is Pressed but Not Crushed. Pressed but Not Crushed. Thank you, Brother Hunman, for the great sermon slide today. Pressed but not crushed. Great picture. Perfect picture. All right, if we all take a moment to go ahead and get that visual in your head. Pressed but not crushed. All right, Acts chapter 18. After this, he left Athens and went to Corinth, where he found a Jew named Aquila, and a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. All right, we'll pause there. So basically, he meets this couple here, and probably along with a lot of other Jewish people in this town. They are basically political refugees, right? The emperor, Claudius, basically ordered all the Jews to get out of Rome, right? Most likely, there were just constant disturbances, right? Just disrupting the peace because the Jews and these Christians, these Christians are converting in a very rapid pace, and it's causing a lot of disturbances in the city. And so if you look back in history, Emperor Claudius, he basically ordered all the Jews to be sent out because of constant disturbances among the Jews at the instigation of someone named Chrestus. Chrestus. Does that sound like anything? Chrestus? We had a retreat theme with the word very close. Christos, right? So it's highly likely, especially because if you look back in records, there's no record of anybody named Chrestus, okay? And so this could have been just a mispronunciation of Christos or Jesus, okay? So Jesus, right, there's Christians converting, or Jews converting to Christianity, and that's making the religious leaders, Jewish leaders, angry, and it's causing a lot of issues. And so basically, he just orders all of them to get out of Rome. Okay, and so just take a moment to pause and really take in the gravity of that. Right? Anyone here grew up in the home that you're in now? Or the city that you're in now, you grew up there. Like, all your roots are there, right? That's all you know, the house you're in now. Okay, right? So just imagine your parents have been working for X amount of time to pay for that house, and they've invested so much into that home and your life and everything, the school that you go to now, the sports teams that you're on now. Like, they've invested so much into your life right here, right now. And then because there's so much going on between Jews and Christians or whatever, the governor orders you to get out. You have to just get up and go to a different city, right? You could imagine that'd be very discouraging, right? If your parents suddenly have to leave the job that they've been at for X amount of years, they're planning to get their retirement and to settle down here where they've invested everything, and you lose all of that. You lose all that, and you have to start over again, okay? And so this is the situation in which Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila, okay? And then before we move on, right, some of you might be wondering, okay, how is there all these Christians, how is there a church in Rome before Paul even gets there, okay? Most likely at Pentecost, if you guys remember, people from all over the world, they were there, and they saw what was happening. They received the Holy Spirit, and so there were probably people at Pentecost that went back to Rome and established the church there, and that's how Paul was able to meet fellow Christians like Priscilla and Aquila here in this Corinthian synagogue. They're in a place called Corinth now, okay? And so Paul came to them, verse 3, and since they were of the same occupations, tent makers by trade, he stayed with them and worked, okay? Now, a couple things. So in those times, rabbis, okay, they were taught to learn a trade, okay? Because this was not a well-paying position. Being a pastor still today is not a well-paying position. Okay, and so they understood that there could be times where they might not even be able to be paid. Okay, so they're not well paid to begin with. They're not really able to have a good savings to begin with, but there could be times where they're not paid at all. Okay, and this does not mean, okay, and this passage should never be used by churches, by people, by you guys, to say that this means that pastors shouldn't expect pay. Okay, that's not what it means. All right, Paul, in other parts of scriptures, he says that pastors should receive fair pay, okay, that they should receive a fair wage, all right? But pastors, rabbis, spiritual teachers, spiritual leaders, we can't force people to pay us, right? That would not be a good look, okay? We should not be fighting for our wages, right? And so the teaching was that you should have a good backup, okay, a good backup plan, something to help you in those times where you might not get paid, all right? And so Paul, what he took up was tent making, okay, or more literally, it was working with leather, okay, and the leather was often used for tents, and so that's why we call them tent makers, all right? Verse 4, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself. Okay, everybody say, Paul devoted himself. Okay, what does devoted himself literally mean? It means that he was pressed, that he was constrained on all sides to the Spirit. Okay, so just imagine Paul, he has a soul, okay, as we all do, right? The very core, the very center of ourselves, and he's being pressed and constrained on all sides, like to his very core. That's what it literally means. The Greek means Paul, when it says Paul devoted himself. Okay, so Paul, he was pressed, he was constrained on all sides. He was pressed to his spirit to preach the word and testify to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. When they resisted, okay, so just imagine, right? Paul is here. Okay, he's been risking his life, right? Being, sent from one city to the next, and he's here, he's in the synagogue, and he's being pressed to his soul to preach the gospel to these people, right? Paul's not doing this to bother people. He's not doing it to just like to poke at people and get them angry and to trigger people. That's not Paul's heart. Paul's heart is out of absolute love. Okay, and so he's being constrained on all sides to preach this good news, to let his people know the good news. But what did they do? How did they respond? They resisted and blasphemed. Okay, and the word here for blasphemed is literally to range in battle against. Okay, and speak evil of. So when it says they resisted and blasphemed, it literally means they ranged in battle. They positioned themselves in battle form, okay? They postured themselves in battle against Paul to speak evil towards him. Why? Why? Come on, man. What's wrong with you guys? Why are you being like this? And then what did Paul do? He grew a little frustrated. He shook out his clothes and told them, your blood is on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I'm going to the Gentiles. And this is very similar to when Jesus told his disciples that when you go to a town and they reject you, shake the dust off your feet and move on to the next town. Right? What did he mean by that? Why did Jesus say that? Basically, the Jews, the Jewish people, when they would go to a Gentile area, a Gentile town, Gentile territory, and then they would come back for whatever reason, right? Maybe they had some business to take care of or whatever. First of all, they didn't like to go into Gentile territory, and even if they did, they were practicing 6 feet way before we did, right? Way before COVID, right? They did not allow any Gentiles to come near them. But if they had to go into Gentile territory and they would come back into Jewish territory, they would dust the dirt off of their sandals before they would come back in. What do they mean by that? It's basically all those sinful, filthy people. Like if somehow their corruption is like coming back with me to my people, to my clean people, I'm gonna dust that off of me. I'm gonna brush that off of me, right? And Jesus turned that against back onto them. Right? And so Jesus and Paul, they're basically flipping this around to the Jews, right? You think you're so holy. Or you think you're so great. You think you're so not like them, not like those Gentiles, not sinful. But really, as Jesus said, you're trying to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye while you've got a plank in yours, right? It's like you got a plank coming out your eye, and you're like trying to like nitpick at the sins of other people and take the specks out of their eye, right? Jesus is saying that we're hypocrites. And so Paul is basically saying, I did what I could, right? I did my job, right? I've poured out my heart. I've risked my life, right? One of the teachers said this in our teachers' meeting as we're preparing for Bible study today. But it's clear that when Paul went from town to town, who he prioritized, right? He always went where first? To the synagogues. He went to his people, the Jewish people first. Every time. And so it's clear that he prioritized them. But you rejected. And so when you're judged, when that day comes, when judgment day comes, and you're condemned, that's your own fault. It's no longer my hands. And we see biblical backing for this, right? Jesus condones this. And so even for you guys, when you are praying for your friends, right? You pour your heart out into praying for your friends, and you muster up the courage to go to those people at school or wherever to tell them about Christ, and it doesn't go the way that you were hoping it would go, and they reject you, but you don't let it dishearten you. You don't let it discourage you because you love them. You care about them. You've shed tears because you believe there's a heaven and a hell, and that you need Jesus to go to heaven, and you've cried over the thought of seeing them condemned to hell. And so you keep at it. You keep trying to bring it into your conversations. You keep trying to gently guide them to the truth of Jesus, but they just reject you over and over. They ridicule you. They make fun of you. They persecute you. Well, I'm going to tell you, Jesus has made it clear that you don't have to live in guilt over that you can brush the dust off of your feet, and you can move on if you've done what you could do, okay? All right, verse 7. So he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus. And it's very interesting here, right, that Paul has grown frustrated with the people in the synagogue, but this is what God does right after, okay? He was a worshiper of God whose house was next door to the synagogue, and Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, not just any attending member, but the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord along with his whole household. Man, that is an epic moment. That is an epic moment, right? Paul, he came to the end of himself, right? He was so frustrated. But then the leader of the synagogue and his whole household, they get saved, okay? And we've been seeing that the religious leaders are the hardest people to evangelize to. The religious leaders are the ones that are following Paul and his team from town to town to poison the minds of others, to not be able to receive the gospel. But we have a leader here that converts with this family. And not just that, but many of the Corinthians, when they heard, believed and were baptized. I'll say that again. Many of the Corinthians, when they heard, believed and were baptized. Everyone say Corinthians. All right. Corinthians. What sort of, feelings came with that term, Corinthian? If you were someone from Corinth, right? The Corinthian, if that was ever I can't talk here. If the Corinthian was ever played in an act, okay, in those times, in a play, right? The Corinthian was always depicted as the drunkard, okay? If someone called you a Corinthian, that always meant that you're like a really sinful person, right? So, I don't know what kind of terms you guys use. I don't know if there's like a Gen Z term for this, but we would say like someone who's very like hedonistic, right? Someone who's just really into just the fleshly pleasures, right? That was the Corinthian, right? Corinth was a very sinful place, a lot like Vegas, okay, Las Vegas. I don't know if any of you have been there and you've noticed some of it, but we talked about the Areopagus last time, right? The place that you would think of when you think of Athens. But there was a place in Corinth where there was the temple to Aphrodite's. Okay, I'm sure many of you have heard that before. But at the temple of Aphrodite's, there were little ones. Close your ears. There were over 1,000 temple prostitutes. Okay, and this was a town that a lot of business would come through because it was this peninsula, and a lot of trade routes would go through here. And so a lot of the business people, as they would go through, they would do, as you can imagine, what they would do with these temple prostitutes. But these were the type of people in this type of society, a very secular, sinful society, that were converting, and many of them, and becoming baptized, all right? But even with all of that, great stuff, epic moments. Leader of the synagogue, his whole family gets saved. These sinful Corinthians, they're converting, they're getting saved. But even with all that, there are signs that Paul is very human. Okay, Paul is scared. There's a lot of persecution, a lot of oppression, all right? Verse 9, and so the Lord said to Paul in a night vision, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, but keep on speaking and don't be silent. For I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you or to hurt you, because I have many people in this city. All right, so it's kind of hard to imagine, but Paul is afraid. And in this moment, it's probably pretty hard to count the blessings, to see the fruit, right? I know a lot of us, we're looking at this and saying, hey, Paul, come on, man. You've got some awesome victories here. Be motivated by that. Be encouraged by that. But that is still a small fraction of the many people that are rejecting the gospel. That is a small fraction of the many Jewish people, his people. All right, for us, it would be like going to Korea, or not all of us, I'm sorry, many of us, going to Korea and being rejected by everyone, the vast majority of the people there. It's like, come on, man, my people, what's going on? Right, I was in Korea, and do you guys know, I think I mentioned this before, but do you know what percent of young adults in Korea right now identify as a Christian? So people from like 18 to 35. Do you know what percent? It's 3%. It's wild, right? It's wild. Things are not good in Korea right now. But that is the feeling that is overwhelming Paul. That is the feeling that is causing him to feel constrained to his very core, right? Feeling pressed. And the opposition, it keeps growing, right? It's one thing to clash with thousands of people if you've got an army with you, even a small army of maybe a few hundred. But you're a small group, a small team of 4, 5, 6 people, and there are thousands of people coming against you, right? Maybe don't raise your hand, but anyone get in a fight before at school? You ever show up to a fight with just you and like a couple of friends, and then they come with like an army, like 50, 60 people, or like, I don't know, 10, 12 people? So this is what's going on for Paul. But he has this very Abrahamic moment. For me, it reminds me a lot of the moments that Abraham had with God, where it's like, you don't see, you yourself, you don't see how the little that you have, right? For Abraham, even just having one child was a miracle, absolute miracle, right? Grandpa and grandma just had a child. It's a complete miracle. But as epic as that victory is, as epic as that moment is, you still don't see how that adds up to God's promise of me having descendants like the stars, like the grains of sand. It's like, all right, God, all right, Isaac, it's pretty awesome. It's pretty cool. It's nothing short of an absolute miracle. But explain to me how this is going to end up in a nation as numerous as the stars. And the same thing for Paul. He never could have known just how many he would reach. Right? Paul, in his human mind, would never be able to know just how many he would reach, right? Guys, everyone say, thank you, Paul. We're sitting here today because of Paul. Right? We're sitting here today because, I mentioned this last time, a guy named Martin Luther recognized, he had a revelation of the grace message in Paul's letter, and that birthed the Protestant movement, and that's why we are a Protestant church, a Protestant denomination, sitting here today. Right? Along with hundreds of thousands, millions of people along with us. Right? So just imagine how many people in history have been truly saved by grace through faith because of Paul. Right? And so he has this brief moment, this encounter with God, to be reminded of that Paul, there's great things coming in the future. Right? And that gave Paul the strength to keep going. And so verse 11, he stayed there for a year and a half, okay? And this was the longest place, the longest he stayed somewhere in his second missionary journey, okay? And so just this short encounter with God was enough fuel to keep him there for a year and a half, teaching the word of God among them in this very sinful place in Corinth. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack against Paul. Okay, so it keeps coming, right? Wave after wave. They keep uniting to bring these attacks against Paul, and he brought him to the tribunal. This man, they said, is persuading people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. As Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, all right, here's where God shows up. If it were a matter of wrongdoing or of a serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you Jews. But if these are questions about words, names, and your own law, see to it yourself. I refuse to be a judge of such things. So he drove them out from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But none of these things matter to Gallio. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So as God promised, this was not yet time for Paul, right? It's not yet over for Paul. It's not time for him to go yet. Right? And so Paul, he could keep spreading the gospel in confidence because even though he's being pressed in from all sides by the opposition, he wouldn't be crushed. He would not be crushed until it was God's time. Right? And this shows that God had everything in control. As hard as it was to see, as hard it was for Paul to feel, God had everything under control. But that doesn't mean that nothing negative would happen. There was a lot of pressing. There was a lot of negative things going on. But God decides when our time is done. Right? And Paul will later write to these very Corinthians. He'll write in a letter to the Corinthian church, we are pressed but not crushed. Everyone say pressed but not crushed. Persecuted but not abandoned. We are struck down but not destroyed. For we have this treasure in clay jars. Everyone say clay jars. So that this extraordinary power may be from God and not us. Guys, when we depend on ourselves, when we try to live this Christian life, when we try to live out this calling on our own strength, when we depend on ourselves, we're what? I just said it. We're what? Clay jars. We're just clay jars. Are clay jars strong? What happens when you drop them? They shatter, right? Or crack. Right? We'll break. But when we rely on God, and the whole world is pressing in on you, or your group of friends is pressing in on you, or the culture at school is pressing in on you, it's not going to crush you when you are relying on God, when you are relying on the power of God. And what does that do? What kind of testimony does that share? What does that tell people? It makes people wonder, what is this extraordinary power? Right? Because anyone else in these normal circumstances would have been crushed. Right? I don't know if you've experienced it before, if you've been bullied before, if you've been just completely hounded or even physically beat up by people before. But when people persecute you, when they utter all kinds of evil towards you, when they do those things, they expect you to get crushed. Right? When they beat on you verbally or physically, they're expecting you to get crushed. But when the Christian, like Paul, leans in on God and does not get crushed, that speaks a special message to the people around you. Hey, why is this guy not getting crushed like everyone else? Why is this girl not getting crushed by everyone else? And they're going to wonder, what do they have that I don't have? What's keeping them from getting crushed? What's preventing them from allowing my words to break their bones? And then that will spread a testimony, right? That will allow Jesus to be a light onto the world around us, right? And that'll tell people that it's not us, but it's God. All right, so if we could bow our heads.